Good morning, class. It's so nice to see you this morning, and we're studying in Deuteronomy, and we are in chapter 5, and we're studying the Ten Commandments. Does anybody need a class book? Mark's going to pass them out if you need one. If you don't have one. Okay. Wednesday night, we talked about the beginning and the end of chapter 5 to see that how the people, or to see what God had to say to the people, the situations surrounding the giving of the law. And then we jumped over to the end of the chapter and discussed how it was received and the other things that needed to be said as they went back to their tents to contemplate what all they had heard. So today we get into we're going to talk about the actual commandments themselves, or talk about the commandments and what they mean and why they were given. Again, we already have it in Exodus, and you say, well, why are they doing it again? Well, we'll get a little insight into that this morning as we go along. Before we start, though, Mike Rubson's going to lead us in prayer.
Pray with me. Father God, we're so grateful, we're so thankful that you are our God and that you affirm who you are as we study. We ask you to quieten our souls, help us to pay attention. Lord God, you are speaking to us. We thank you so much for your Son, Jesus, and we pray in his name.
Thank you, Mike. As we think about the commandments, we must understand what they are, why they are. I'm a simple man, and I'm reading this, and when I think about the Ten Commandments, I think about the preamble to the Constitution. There's a preamble, and it basically gives out what the Constitution's all about. The Ten Commandments are given out as we see in our study lesson. The Ten Commandments are the 10 words that we find in Exodus 34 and in Deuteronomy 10, and they're the foundation of God's law, God's covenant with the Israelites. And so we see then that, and Alan is just raring to go as we get into if you look across the bar at the top, you see that today we're studying in Deuteronomy 5, 6, and 7, or in my time it's 5, 6, and 7, but then as we progress in Deuteronomy, Moses gives the particulars of the law, specifics that have to do with the various and sundry situations that people find themselves in. And so we'll be seeing that in classes going forward. It's interesting, when we discussed Wednesday night, there was a lot of discussion on what the people heard. The fact that is, number one, God was speaking. Moses was mediating. But we get into it. We try to understand, well, if God was speaking, why didn't the people hear it? Well, they did. But along with it, it's kind of like trying to read a book, and the kid is playing the mandolin or playing the piano while you're trying to read, and you're constantly distracted. And that's the picture I have in my mind of what the Israelites had to put up with as it did because of the lightning and the thunder and everything like that. But the point is that the Ten Commandments were spoken directly by God to the people, as we read here in chapter 5. And the rest of the law will be mediated through Moses, of course, at the request of the people. The Ten Commandments are given in a form of general instructions. And so we see that. And as we get further into it, we'll see the differences in if you do this, that will happen. If you don't do this, this won't happen. Or you'll get a simple thou shalt or a thou shalt not. And that's the way the thing develops. And so this morning we'll talk about these things. But let's think for just a minute why the Ten Commandments were coming in, or why the Ten Commandments? Why the Ten Commandments? And the first thing that we need to think about is that in the Ten Commandments, God was preparing a great human family. A great human family with moral responsibilities. And they were going to answer to the government of God. See, now, in the early days, they did a lot of offering of sacrifices, and they continued to do this, don't get me wrong. But there's a change that we're going to see, a little addition that we're going to see. It's going to be emphasized more, and we've already hinted to it when I asked you Wednesday night to recite Matthew chapter 22. What's the first commandment? What's the greatest commandment? Listen to that. And now, somebody help the preacher. What's the second great commandment? Love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commands hang the law and the prophets. So we don't want to get in the mud looking at these Ten Commandments and trying to figure everything out, because it's already figured out for us when we look at the Ten Commandments. We must understand then that God's people was the church in the wilderness. Have you ever thought of it that way? God's people were the church in the wilderness. He called them to the wilderness. They were called out. Yeah, they were called out in the wilderness, and they had their own institutions, which were made up of whatever God wanted them to do, you see, and there was appropriate worship. But that was all going to change. And so he's preparing them for the change that's going to come. You see, the Israelites had been rescued from bondage in Egypt. And they were about to have a commonwealth of their own. It wasn't going to be the same. And isn't it so fun? Isn't it strange that throughout their wilderness wanderings that we want to go back to Egypt where the cucumbers are? Can you imagine? We want to go back to that. We liked it back there. That's the heartbreak of human interaction with God. They were about to have a commonwealth of their own. Civil regulations had to be set in place. And so the Ten Commandments are what we're seeing as these regulations, things that protect us as far as God is concerned, and things that protect us as far as our interactions with each other are concerned. The first 5 commandments are 4 commandments have to do with a God-to-God relationship, and the rest of them have to do with God-to-man relation, or man-to-man relationships. And so we are keenly aware, and should be keenly aware. They're going to wander for years in the wilderness, but the ceremonial laws would pass away. They would pass away, but the underlying principles would be permanent. And so we need to keep that in mind, that the things that they did would pass away. And we'll see this as we study the 10 Commandments. Any question or comment? Anything you'd like to say? Anybody? Mark, glad to have you back. We missed you.
Good to be back. You mentioned why, and you think about everything God does. He has purpose, but He also has timing, and it was the right time when the law came. And also, you think about the timing difference between the deliverance of the law to the deliverance of bringing salvation through Christ. It was in God's time. Everybody talks about when the end of time comes, it's not God's time, so therefore we don't need to be concerned about that as much as the time that's in front of us. And so God has given us something that we can look at and understand that when it's time for the things to be put in place, Israel always had to go under His time schedule and not their own. They weren't delivered until it was God's time to bring them out of Egypt. They weren't, and we weren't delivered until it was God's time to send His Son. So timing means a lot, not only back then, but to us even today.
Good. You?
Great minds of same plot. I was wondering, I was want to say something about the timing right here. That when the first time they gave the law, God said, you should keep these because I created you. It was because I am the Lord of creation. But here He says, He just went through 1 through 6 about the mountain and the fire and all that stuff. And then He mentions that I led you out of slavery in Egypt. So He's giving them reasons why He should be the only God. So He's got more reasons now than He had the first time. So.
Well said. Well said. Anybody else?